You're watching Qnews and this is the Economic Bulletin. We'll be bringing you comprehensive coverage and expert insights on the latest economic trends and developments. The second day of the G20 summit took place in Rio de Janeiro on Tuesday to advance discussions on sustainable development and cleaner energy transitions. The G20 leaders released a statement urging a dramatic increase in climate finance, calling for contributions to scale from billions to trillions to address global warming. They also pushed for COP29 climate summit negotiators to finalize a financial agreement on how much wealthy nations will provide to developing countries. This financial goal remains a key sticking point in the talks. At the G20 summit, the Chinese President Xi Jinping emphasized the need for global economic governance centered on cooperation, stability, openness, innovation, and eco-friendliness. He called for stronger global economic partnerships and enhanced macro-policy coordination. On trade, the Chinese president urged reform of the World Trade Organization, expressed opposition to protectionism, and promoted equal and inclusive industrial partnerships. Xi also stressed on the importance of improving global financial governance by increasing the representation of developing countries and supporting green financing initiatives. He also highlighted the importance of advancing the digital economy and hosting a global AI conference in 2025. Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva told G20 leaders at their annual summit that international tax cooperation is essential to reducing inequality, amid a push by the host country to discuss a global wealth tax on the super rich.
A cooperação tributária internacional é crucial para reduzir desigualdades. Estudos encomendados pela trilha de finanças do G20 são reveladores. Uma taxação de 2% sobre o patrimônio de indivíduos super ricos poderia gerar recursos da ordem de 250 bilhões de dólares por ano para serem investidos no enfrentamento dos desafios sociais e ambientais do nosso tempo.
At the G20 summit, Brazil launched the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, a new initiative aimed at eradicating both challenges by 2030. The alliance, which includes 148 founding members from 82 countries, along with international organizations and philanthropic groups, seeks to reach 500 million people with cash transfer programs and to provide high-quality school meals to 150 million children in poverty-stricken regions. It also aims to raise billions in funding through multilateral development banks to support these efforts.
A aliança nasce no G20, mas seu destino é global.
The first day of the G20 summit in Rio de Janeiro concluded with world leaders reaffirming their commitment to addressing global issues such as hunger, poverty and inequality, while promoting sustainable development in all its dimensions. In a joint declaration, the G20 leaders also emphasized the need to reform global governance to better tackle the challenges of the 21st century. The declaration also included calls to introduce a global tax on billionaires and to expand the UN Security Council beyond its current 5 permanent members.
With a focus on economic recovery, climate change, and geopolitical tensions, the G20 summit has entered its second and final day in Rio de Janeiro. The first day concluded with a joint declaration emphasizing the resilience of global economic activity amid easing inflation. However, the statement also highlighted uneven growth across countries, raising concerns about potential economic divergence. Leaders stressed the urgency of addressing cost of living pressures, maintaining fiscal sustainability, and mitigating cross-border spillovers. Central banks reaffirmed their commitment to price stability, while fiscal policies aimed to rebuild buffers and encourage investments in productivity-enhancing reforms. The G20 reaffirmed its dedication to the Sustainable Development Goals, acknowledging that only 17% of targets are on track. Alarmingly, nearly half show minimal or moderate progress, while over one-third are stalled or regressing. Through the Rio Declaration, the G20 leaders delivered a unified message that advancing resilience, equity, and sustainable prosperity requires global unity, innovation, and a shared vision for long-term success.
And joining us today to discuss the G20 Day 2's key themes and discussions is Dipanjan Roy, the economic expert. Mr. Roy, thank you very much for being with us on the show. Now, first off, what do you see as the most significant commitments in the communique of the first day of the summit?
Right. Good evening. Greetings from New Delhi, India. It's a pleasure to be on this show on this very important G20 summit in Rio at a very critical juncture in the geopolitics and geoeconomics. I think the focus of President Lula is very important in today's juncture, which is about poverty alleviation and removing inequality. I think that was a very bold and a unique move, and this has been his philosophy. I mean, his the philosophy of his life. You know, how to address inequality. This is his belief. His based on his lifelong struggle against removing inequality, giving people a better life, and I think that was his motto. I mean, in his primary goal in this G20, and I think he's been quite successful in that. But we have to see how this the proposal for global wealth tax is accepted by the developed countries or by the rich countries, by the OECD countries, put it precisely. We don't know how they are. I mean, how would they react, and whether we can G20 actually can, because G20 is not an executive body. It doesn't have a secretariat. Whether it can, implement that, which means all the G20 members have to implement that. So, if you look at G20, it's almost a vertical divide between members who are members of G7 and EU, and the rest are all countries of the global south. So, the countries of the global south, of course, has been disadvantaged for decades. And how these developed countries react to this proposal for global wealth tax, I'm not very certain at this stage how would they react. But definitely, it's a very bold move, and I think President Lula has kind of shaped this G20 based on his philosophy. It's philosophy based on which he has delivered for Brazilian economy, even in first two terms.
Yes.
and he's trying to
Well,
give
sir,
a better life to
can you
the.
highlight the most pressing economic challenges that the G20 is trying to address this year, especially that you've mentioned they're not an executive body, and how realistic really are the proposed solutions?
I think if, like in 2008, I mean, after the 2000, G20 came into being after the 2008 crisis, right? So, and there is a crisis which has been created by COVID, firstly, which has impacted the global economy, and then the two conflicts, the Ukraine conflict and also the conflict in West Asia. That has also impacted the global economies because the supply chains have got disrupted. So, in these circumstances, there have been rising inequality in various countries, in various developing countries, countries which were about to attain from a least developed status to a developing status. They have been impacted very badly in South Asia and elsewhere, and they really need a kind of guidance in this area, how to pull out of this kind of situation which was created by COVID, and that has impacted jobs of millions of people, and countries have gone into debt because of that. So I think the onus is on G20 countries in both the developed as well as the emerging economies to hammer out a formula which can be then universally accepted in addressing the matter of inequality.
So, now, the climate finance pledges and proposed mechanisms, do you think that they're adequate enough to meet the needs of the developing nations?
Not yet. I think these are not yet enough. The developed countries, the industrialized countries have to do more than the developing countries because they have been creating this crisis for decades, actually. They are industrialized much before the developing countries have become industrialized. And still, emerging economies are still not as industrialized as the developed countries. So I think the onus is largely on them, and they should have create have more arrange more finances for mitigating climate impact.
Well, in regards to the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, what potential do
Hmm.
you think it has to reduce global inequality, as you've mentioned?
Yeah, I think it's a very novel proposal, and if countries can take inspiration from that, and this is the guiding principle essentially. So if and if you notice that G20 presidency has now been in emerging economies, Indonesia followed by uh, India, and then Brazil, and then it passed on to South Africa. These are big economies. These are developing economies. These are now emerging economies. As and all incidentally, three of them are members of BRICS. And Indonesia is a BRICS partner, like Egypt is a member of the BRICS. And I think they can, if these countries can move something, so G20 cannot make it binding on countries. But then if countries can put together, there is some formula which is, and that is being implemented by various countries, member states of G20. I think to a large extent, this issue of joblessness, inequality, which has been caused, in my personal opinion,
Yes.
COVID-19 played a very big impact on this, particularly on some of these smaller economies which were doing reasonably well around that time. And the
Yes.
impact was not felt immediately. Impact was felt after 3 years. Yeah.
Mr. Dipanjan Roy, the journalist at Economic Times India, thank you very much, sir, for your insights. And now we move to the latest economic developments from around the world. The International Monetary Fund has warned that retaliatory tariffs could hurt Asia's economic growth, increase costs and disrupt supply chains, despite the region's status as a key driver of global growth. IMF Asia Pacific Director Krishna Srinivasan cautioned that such tariffs could lead to longer and more inefficient supply chains and could harm exporting nations. His comments come amid concerns over U.S. President-elect Donald Trump's plan for a 60% tariff on Chinese goods and a 10% tariff on other imports. Thailand's economy expanded faster than expected in the third quarter after expanding exports and government spending. Data from the Office of the National Economic and Social Development Council showed that the gross domestic product in the 3 months through September rose 3% from a year earlier. The data projected that the Thai economy will grow by 2.6% in 2024, driven by heightened government consumption and investment, a rise in domestic private demand, the ongoing recovery of the tourism sector, and sustained growth in exports. Looking ahead to 2025, the outlook remains positive, with projected growth anticipated to range between 2.3 and 3.3%. Thailand's government will launch the second phase of its digital wallet scheme in January, distributing $1.16 billion to 4 million people. This follows the initial rollout of a $14 billion stimulus plan in September, providing $289 each to 45 million people. About a third of the payments have been made so far, despite some delays. The second phase will prioritize individuals over 60, with cash transfers expected by late January ahead of the Lunar New Year. Additionally, debt relief measures will assist borrowers with overdue debts, with housing support for low-income earners as planned as part of the scheme. According to the National Development and Reform Commission, China's economic performance is expected to continue its upward trend into November and December, driven by a series of incremental policies. Since October, the economy has shown positive signs, including a 3.9% year-on-year increase in the transaction volume of newly built and second-hand homes, the first growth after 8 months of decline. Additionally, the average daily trading volume in Shanghai and Shenzhen stock markets surged by nearly 150%, signaling improved market confidence and business expectations. The Commission expects these positive trends to persist, supported by the cumulative impact of new and ongoing policy measures. Data showed that Canada's annual inflation rate accelerated more than expected to 2% in October, as gas prices fell less than the previous month. A report from Statistics Canada says prices in October increased at a faster annual pace in 5 out of the 8 major components of the Consumer Price Index. Statistics Canada data showed that on a monthly basis, the Consumer Price Index rose by 0.4% after 2 consecutive monthly declines. Ukraine's parliament approved its 2025 state budget on Tuesday, allocating a record 2.2 trillion hryvnias to or 26% of GDP for defense and security. Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal stated that all taxes will be directed to defense, with funds earmarked for weapons production, industry modernization and drone purchases. The 2025 budget forecasts total spending at 3.6 trillion hryvnias, with revenue projections at 2.05 trillion. To finance the gap, Ukraine will introduce wartime tax increases for businesses and citizens, with the deficit covered by international aid. As part of Ukraine's efforts to finance its 2025 budget gap, the International Monetary Fund announced reaching a preliminary agreement with Ukrainian authorities that would give Ukraine access to about $1.1 billion. However, the agreement is still pending approval from the IMF's executive board, which is expected to review the deal in the coming weeks. If approved, this would bring the total disbursed to Ukraine under the program to $9.8 billion. The IMF forecasts 4% growth for Ukraine's GDP in 2024, with a slowdown to 2.5% to 3.5% in 2025 due to energy disruptions and labor shortages. In the MENA region, the International Monetary Fund has stated that Oman's economy continues to expand, driven by favorable hydrocarbon revenues and ongoing reform efforts. In its end-of-mission press release following the 2024 Article 4 consultation, the fund highlighted that Oman's economic growth was 1.2% in 2023, accelerating to 1.9% year-on-year in the first half of 2024. While oil production cuts under OPEC Plus weighed on growth, the non-hydrocarbon sector saw strong performance, growing 1.8% in 2023 and 3.8% in the first half of 2024. The growth will be supported by higher hydrocarbon production and acceleration of non-hydrocarbon growth, according to the IMF. Goldman Sachs predicts the S&P 500 index will climb to 6,500 by the end of 2025, citing continued U.S. economic and corporate earnings growth. This projection reflects a 10.3% rise from the index's recent close of 5,893.62. This came a day after Morgan Stanley forecasted the index to hit the same target by late 2024. It estimated the recent broadening in U.S. earnings growth would continue in 2025 as the Federal Reserve cuts interest rates into next year and as business cycle indicators improve further. Global shares had a mixed performance as world leaders meet for the second and final day of the G20 summit. In the United States, the S&P 500 rose 0.4%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average slipped 50.1%, and the Nasdaq, 5.1%, and the Nasdaq Composite gained 0.6%. In Europe, Germany's DAX lost 1.3%, while the CAC 40 in Paris traded 1.5% lower, and Britain's FTSE 100 shed 0.5%. In Asia, Tokyo's Nikkei 225 rose 0.5%, Seoul's Kospi picked up 0.1%, the Shanghai Composite Index rose 0.7%, and Hong Kong's Hang Seng added 0.4%. These are all the economic news we have for now, but here's a roundup of today's key headlines. G20 calls for scale-up in climate finance from billions to trillions. The IMF warns retaliatory tariffs could harm Asia's growth and increase costs. And China's economic growth is to continue in November and December. That's all for today's economic bulletin here on Qnews, but please stay connected for more news and updates. Thank you for joining us.